Thanks everyone for joining the webinar. I apologize for the technical difficulties. Sarah Schremer, who usually introduces these webinars, is having some difficulties, so I'm going to attempt to fill in. So first, I just want to say thank you for joining the webinar entitled New Insights into How Micromobility Services Affect Vehicle Miles Traveled. This is a part of a series of webinars hosted by the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. I also wanted to let everyone know that this will be recorded and posted on the website. So the mission of the National Center is to advance an environmentally sustainable transportation system through cutting-edge research, direct policy engagement, and education of future leaders. So this is one way, our webinar series is one way that we achieve this mission. The NCST is made up of a consortium of universities led by UC Davis and partners UC Riverside, USC, Long Beach State, Texas Southern, Georgia Tech, and the University of Vermont. If you have any technical issues or questions, use the Q&A icon, and we'll be able to see and monitor those throughout the presentation. And then there'll be some live Q&A at the end of the presentation. Hopefully we'll have about 10 minutes for that. Oh, and then who we are. So my name is Dillon Fitch. I'm the co-director of the Bicycling Plus Research Collaborative and research faculty at ITS Davis. I lead a group of researchers focused on bicycling behavior, micromobility services, and all in the focus of reducing car use and increasing environmental sustainability. And with me is postdoc Tatsuya Fukushige, and he's done most of this work, so he's going to be doing most of the speaking, but the work also stems from a big project that we started many years ago. So I'm going to introduce the project and then hand it over to Tatsuya to do most of the presenting. So with that, Tatsuya will share his screen and I'll get us started. Okay, so we are going to start with kind of a big overview of the the problem or the challenges for micromobility services, and show you a little bit about what our research is trying to solve. So as many of you know, there's been a rapid increase in micromobility, shared micromobility, which I'll pause here to define that. When we're using the term micromobility, we're really only talking right now about shared micromobility, that are fleets of bikes, e-bikes, e-scooters, dockless, that have emerged, over the past decade in U.S. cities and abroad. So in some metrics, like this one from NACDO, we see a 26 times increase in shared micromobility trip making. There's this big potential for shared micromobility services to reduce vehicle miles traveled and related emissions, and we're trying to better understand that potential. So there's a base assumption that most users substitute some personal vehicle or ride-hailing trips when they use their bike and scooters, and this has been shown in our past research in the Sacramento region. And it's been shown across the U.S. And abroad, and the related to that substitution for car trips is also this connection to other sustainable modes like transit. So all of these substitution and complementary effects matter if we're going to understand how many vehicle miles traveled. That's the term I'll be using VMT a lot in this talk, and so will Tatsuya. So you can think of it as just car use reduction, how much car use reduction we can get from shared micromobility services. So this is a difficult thing to monitor because a lot of all of our shared micromobility services are kind of independent of our transit service. So for example, transit connections, there's no shared payment across there. So there's no real gold standard for how to measure transit connections. It also requires pretty invasive research methods to understand what people are doing, what they would have done. And that also makes this research fairly counterfactual. So we're going to talk a little bit about how hopefully our research is improving the estimates. But it means that most of the evidence out there is based on survey responses, and we know that brings up a bunch of validity concerns. There's also a problem in the literature on generalization. So most micromobility studies are in 1 or 2 or 3 cities, which is reasonable because it's hard to do research in a lot of cities. But it just means that any research that's done in those cities, it makes it hard to generalize to other cities. So this study definitely improves on that. Here's some research questions that we focused for this presentation. So how are micromobility services used for first and last mile connections to transit? How much additional VMT reduction may be achieved from those transit connections? That's a pretty open question in the literature, since measuring transit connection is pretty poor. And what factors influence car substitution? And that we've done some research on, but not to the scale that we've done in this project. And then what are the relationships between I would say PMT as personal miles traveled, and then VMT, vehicle miles traveled, and then micromobility use at a daily level. So we're trying to better understand how do micromobility services change people's whole overall orientation and how they travel. And all of this is to help us better understand the potential for these services to reduce VMT. So we start this with a data set called the American Micromobility Panel, which was launched in the summer of 2022. And this was a partnership with 5 micromobility service companies. You can see their logos on the bottom of the screen, and also through a consultant, RSG. And the power of this study is the partnership that we created and built, and then allowed the companies to recruit on our behalf. So part of the challenge with studying micromobility services are getting access to the user base. Who are these? How do you contact these people? And so this partnership allowed us to recruit across all 5 of these services. And these are the largest services, at the time, the largest services in the US market. The study extent is shown on the screen. So we studied, these are the 48, there are 48 cities at which the study began. But of course, recruiting in these markets didn't mean that the participants only traveled in these markets. So there's travel behavior in our data set far beyond these 48 cities, but these 48 cities are the micromobility markets that we attempted to study. We ended up recruiting over 2,000 participants, and they recorded over 180,000 trips. And these are mostly labeled, as in the trips are conducted, and then the participant tells us what was going on in their travel behavior. But you can see there's a large chunk of the data, 83,000 of the trips, that the participant didn't label. So I'll talk about that in a second. So one of the innovative parts of this study was that it included a travel diary survey, or a smartphone travel diary survey. RSG calls this prompted recall. So how it works is the participant would download the app, and it would be running during the study period, which was a 21-day travel diary. And as they moved, the app would recognize the travel, and then it would prompt the user with some survey questions. So you can see an image on the screen that says that shows a start and an end. And this survey would ask questions like, what was the purpose of your trip? What mode did you use? And we had a couple specific questions in the app that were to this study, designed for this study. So if they made a micromobility trip, we asked some additional questions such as, what mode would they have used if micromobility wasn't available? So that's that mode substitution question. We asked if they were connecting to transit, and then we asked about their parking behavior as well. So as you can imagine, this is a pretty onerous ask of the participants, because not only do they have to download this app, but we're asking them to answer questions about nearly every trip they make. The app is a little smart in that if they start making very, very similar trips, origins, destinations that are very similar, it will guess some of these prompts and then just ask the user to confirm whether the guess was correct. So it's still considered prompted recall even when the app is guessing. So as you can imagine, this data was not clean, even though it's GPS travel diaries or smartphone travel diaries are seen as kind of the gold standard for tracking travel behavior. There's a lot of issues with them. So here are some on this first bullet. There were just invalid trips. Trip identification and segmentation wasn't perfectly done. Like, the app didn't recognize a stop when there was clearly a stop. And then there was a lot of missing labels. So people didn't fill out the surveys even though they traveled. So we went through 9+ months of data cleaning, and here's a workflow that kind of shows the cleaning process. We're not going to get into it here, but if you have any questions about it, Tatsuya will be happy to answer the details. And along with the cleaning process also went some imputation of missing data, and so that we could have a full data set to analyze. So I'll just leave it at that, but we can answer some questions at the end if you have questions about our cleaning process. So the other thing that we think is an advance in terms of the methodology compared to other micromobility studies is we use trip weights. So every study has got sampling and error and non-response bias that makes it difficult to generalize beyond the sample that you collect. What we requested from the companies and were delivered by 4 of the 5 companies was a count of users by the number of person-specific trips in every market for different vehicle types. The vehicle types we just generalized to bikes and scooters. So bikes would include e-bikes. And this allowed us to look at the frequency of trip making in our data set and then post-stratify that into a sample that was representative of that trip making. Trip making is all we really have because the shared micromobility companies don't have sociodemographics or anything that you would normally post-stratify by. They just have trip making. But by post-stratifying by trip making, we essentially get representative trip making in our, at least for micromobility trips, not for all the other travel. So we post-stratified by these 40 cells of whether you're a frequent user or a regular user of micromobility, which of the 5 companies you were making the trip, whether you were using a spin scooter or a lift bike, whether you were in a big and dense city or a non-big and dense city, which Tatsuya will describe, and then whether you were using a bike or e-scooter. So it just helps us generalize. The next slide will show you kind of what that might look like in terms of bias correction. So in the left column, you'll see that these are the unweighted trips that we collected in the diary. So we collected over 10,000 bike share trips in big and dense cities, and only 1,300 or so in other cities. And then it was reversed for e-scooters, only 1,400 e-scooter trips in big and dense cities and almost 5,000 in other cities. But by the time we weighted to the trip making that was occurring across all these markets by these operators, you can see the percentages shift. So these weighted numbers are just a daily weight. So these are like the total number of micromobility trips in all of the markets in our study on a given average day during our study period. And you can see there's some slight shifts in the percentages, particularly the e-scooter trips. We undersampled e-scooter trips in other cities, actually across the board. And we oversampled bike share trips in other cities by quite a bit. In big and dense cities, not so much, but really those bike share trips in other cities were over reported. Okay, so that's a big overview of the data, and now I'm going to hand it over to Tatsuya to tell you about our findings.
Thank you, Dillon. So in my part, I will talk about our finding based on our analysis of AMP data. So firstly, I will present our finding regarding mode substitution in micromobility trips. So in our survey, Dillon mentioned that we asked participants about what travel modes they would use if micromobility service was not available. So basically, we asked the participant of the mode substitution of micromobility trips. And basically, we found that walking was a dominant substitute mode in both bike share and scooter share trips. This find is actually consistent with other existing studies. And we also found that introducing the micromobility services induced about 10 to 13% of the trip in our data set. And this suggests that micromobility plays an important role in enhancing mobility and accessibility, and also bringing some social benefits such as increased physical activity and economic vitality for communities. But on the other hand, the car substitution rate, which is associated with BMT reduction and which we are interested in this study, was only 11% of micromobility trips. This car substitution rate is actually much lower than existing study. We think that one possible explanation for this gap is that our participants in this dataset may be biased to car light population. So if participants tend to own a few cars and to use cars less, then car substitution should be less. And in fact, in our dataset, those who own car was about 45%, while one was study, actually our prior study focusing on dockless e-bike share users in Sacramento, the car ownership was 65%. So although Dillon mentioned that we attempted to address this issue by applying the trip weighting, but we still have unknown gap. So we need further investigation about why our car substitution rate was such lower. And also, as a part of our analysis on mode substitution, we examined the factors influencing mode substitution of shared micromobility trips. So we use the reported substituted mode of micromobility trips as a dependent variable. Then we use a statistical model, which is a multi-level, multinomial logistic regression. Basically, we considered 4 types of predictor variable in this modeling process. Predictors we considered include varying effect by person and market area, trip attributes such as trip distance, trip purpose, time of day, and number of trips in a tour, and individual characteristics such as race, age, gender, and driving license, and land use characteristics. So using the statistical analysis, we found that car substitution varies a lot depending on whether users have driving license, and trip distance. So this figure shows a plot about conditional effect of trip distance and driving license on mode substitution of bike share trips. So as you can see, for short distance trip, the dominant substitute mode is walking, which makes sense. But for long trip, rail was the most common alternative mode for those who have on driving license. But on the other hand, bus was the dominant substitute mode for those who do not have on driving license. And personal vehicle or ride hailing, which we are interested in this study, was not dominant substitute mode even at long distance trip. This result is actually not consistent with our prior study in Sacramento that private car was dominant substitute mode at long distance trip. And this is the case for e-scooter trips. So basically the figure looks like similar, but compared to bike share trips, walking has high share of mode substitution, even at the long distance. And another difference from the bike share trips previous figure is that bus was the dominant substitute mode at long distance, even for those who have driving license. And we also found in our model that mode substitution varies by time of day. The figure shows a conditional effect of time of day on mode substitution of bike share mode at long distance trips. So basically, we found that ride hailing is a dominant substitute mode in midnight and night at long bike share trips. And from the modeling as a key finding, so basically bike share was less likely to replace ride hailing trips for commuting purpose, while e-scooter share has an opposite tendency. And our model also shows that when participants have more activities at different places, people are less likely to replace car use than other mode. So this suggests that people may not give up using household vehicle when they need to visit many locations, or many activities in the day often happen in the downtown area, so that we might not observe household vehicle substitution. And we also found that in terms of the individual characteristics, car substitution vary for women by micromobility vehicle type. So our results show that women tend to replace car use more when they use e-scooter share than when they use bike share trips. Okay, so next, we also conducted some analysis about the transit connection of micromobility trips. Basically, based on our data set, our weighted sample shows that a small share of micromobility trips connect to public transit, which is about 5 to 13% of total trips in our data set. So as you see, as we expected, we observed a higher share of transit connection in big and density cities than other cities. Interestingly, we observed similar transit connection rate in bike share and scooter share in any types of cities. But the exception is micromobility trip as an access mode in big and dense city. So as you can see, scooter share trips has higher share compared to bike share trip. We think that this will be because bike share services in big and dense cities act as a substitute rather than complement for public transit. And as I explained before, in our survey, we asked participants about a mode substitution. Here we look at the specific case of micromobility trips, which is a micromobility trip connecting to public transit. Our results show that the most micromobility trip connecting to public transit shift from either walking or public transit, but very few car substitution. And we observe this tendency both in bike share and scooter share trips. And we also observe that when using micromobility, bus connections are less common than rail connection. And in our travel diary survey, we also asked the similar mode substitution question, but for transit trips connecting to micromobility use. The reason why the transit segment matters here is that one example case is a user take a private car from home to a destination. And one possible case if micromobility service was introduced is that user takes micromobility services to access to public transit bus stop or rail station and take public transit to the destination. In this case, to estimate the BMT reduction from micromobility services, we may consider not only the micromobility segment, but also public transit segment. So if we miss transit segment, we will underestimate the BMT reduction. So based on our data, our results show that not surprisingly, mode substitution of transit trip connecting to micromobility use and micromobility trips connecting to public transit were quite similar. And car substitution of the transit trip were less than 10%. But one thing we have to note is that we had not so many cases about transit connection in our data set, which means our result is a little bit questionable about whether our output can be generalized. So that we have to say. And also to understand how transit segment connecting to micromobility trip have impact on estimate BMT reduction from micromobility services, we made a simple comparison. One thing we calculated is just the total micromobility trip distance reported as car substitution. And another estimate we did is include the transit segment connecting to micromobility use, replacing car use, and the total micromobility trip distance reported as car substitution. We observed that adding the transit segment increased 12% of BMT reduction. So as you saw in the previous slide, our data showed small portion of transit connection, which is about 5 to 13%. Actually, we found one existing study showed much higher micromobility transit connection rate in between 17 to 30%, depending on the city. That value is much higher than our output. And one difference between that study and our study is the definition of micromobility transit connection. In our study, transit connection is as having to immediately proceed or succeed each other based on the location data. However, that study asked micromobility user right after riding micromobility trips about whether micromobility trips were connecting to public transit. So it is possible that some people may still say transit connection, even if they have some activity between a micromobility trip and a transit trip. Although in our definition, that doesn't count as a public transit connection. So because of such constrained definition in our study, it would be possible that percent of BMT deduction from transit connection could be larger. And also we want to say like currently most micromobility services in US are not coordinated with public transit well. So if they were coordinated in terms of like quality of infrastructure and payment system, we believe that we will have a large transit connection and BMT reduction. Next, I present our finding about estimated BMT reduction per micromobility trips. So using our weighted samples, we calculated expected BMT reduction per micromobility trip for each market area. In this analysis, we didn't include market area with less than 20 micromobility trips and less than 10 participants because of high uncertainty of the output. And Based on this analysis, we found that bike share services reduced 0.25 miles per bike share trip at the median market, and e-scooter share services reduced 0.15 miles per e-scooter share trip at the median market. So actually, this value was consistent with another study, Fishman's finding that dog bike share services reduced 0.14 miles in Washington, D.C. and 0.42 miles per trip in Minneapolis. But on the other hand, the finding which actually we did, our finding here was not consistent with our prior study that dockless e-bike share in Sacramento reduced 0.58 to 0.85 miles per trip on weekdays. So our previous study got a much higher values here. Next, I present our finding about the relationship between daily activity and micromobility use based on our travel diary survey data. We look at the relationship between car dependency and micromobility use. We did this because we think that micromobility services makes not only direct car substitution, but also other types of BMT reduction, which include like the transit segment connecting to public transit. So on the screen, left figures show the relationship between participant daily average BMT and frequency of micromobility use. And the figure shows that frequent users tend to make fewer BMT compared to infrequent users. And right figure shows the relationship between car dependency in daily activity and frequency of micromobility use. This figure indicates that frequent users rely less on cars for their total BMT than infrequent user. So based on these figures, one possible explanation we have considered is that micromobility services are well replacing car trips, and this shift could potentially reduce car dependency among the frequent user. However, another possible explanation is that a frequent micromobility user might actually already live in areas or follow travel pattern with lower car dependency. So as I showed in the previous slide, we already confirmed that some micromobility trips do replace car trips. The variation in BMT among users of different micromobility frequencies suggests that car substitution alone doesn't account for all differences. So because we don't know the causality between like the micromobility use and car use only based on this figure, so we think this leads us to believe that further investigation is important to understand the relationship. So next, I talk about the prototype BMT reduction estimation tool. So when cities consider introducing micromobility services, they are interested in the potential sustainability benefit. And we think that one way to help cities plan for micromobility services is to provide a tool to estimate the expected BMT reduction from the introduction of micromobility services. In this study, we proposed two types of frameworks and attempted to synthesize our finding into this tool. So the first proposal framework is a simple framework that involves the multiplication of four estimates derived from a separate model. So four estimates basically include the number of micromobility trips, car substitution rate, and average trip distance of micromobility use, and transit connection factor. Because this equation uses just average distance without any distance effect, that as I said, car substitution rate varies by trip distance. So we call this framework the average distance-based framework. So the expected number of micromobility trips will be the most important parameter to have a reliable estimation of potential BMT reduction. One key requirement for this method is a robust model to predict the demand of future micromobility services. We think in the model, the variable in the model should include like the pricing, service area, and social demographic at minimum. And as you know, transportation cost is a critical factor influencing mode choice of resident and total demand of shared services. And depending on the pricing, the expected number of micromobility trips will vary largely. So we found like many existing studies have already proposed some demand model for micromobility services, but the price effect on demand is not explored well. So I think this will be a future study. And for the average car substitution rate, this is another key parameter in the equation. And the existing study found a large variation of car substitution rate by city. But of course, the city which plan to introduce the micromobility services doesn't know the car substitution rate at all. So ideally, a city may conduct a stated preference survey to estimate the expected car substitution rate. But alternatively, we propose to apply the mode substitution model we developed in this study across 48 cities. And I think we think selecting one city level estimate as a match for each specific city. And the third parameter in this equation is the average micromobility trip distance in the market. Our prior study showed the variation of mean trip distance by cities in the range between half mile and 3.6 miles. So this means we need method to predict the average trip distance in the market. And because the average distance depends on market area, availability of vehicle types, and presence of tourists, and so on. So it will be encouraged to make a predictive model for the average mobility trip distance in the market. And last parameter in the equation is a transit connection factor. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, this is one type of indirect effect. So we may include to estimate potential BMT reduction, but in this study, we identified this factor with a 12% to account for the transit segment. But as I said, our sample size was too small to make a conclusion, so we encourage further data collection and analysis for transit connection. And another framework we propose is called the distance effect frameworks. So unlike the first framework, this framework considers the interaction between trip distance and mode substitution. So the first framework using average car substitution rate and average trip distance is a simple and intuitive. But the first framework assumes that all car substitution occurs at any trip distance. However, as I explained in the mode substitution analysis section, we found an important role of trip attribute, especially trip distance and time of day, in predicting a substitution mode. So we think instead of using a mean trip distance, in this framework, we draw a sample from identified distribution of trip distance and predict the substitution mode with the mode substitution model, including a trip attribute for each sample. So that this framework can ensure that the effect of trip distance or mode substitution can be accounted. And also in the equation, we didn't show we didn't show the time of day as a parameter. If the demand model has a parameter for time of day, this framework can be more robust for estimating the potential BMT reduction. And conclusion, future work. So in this study, we basically examined the various aspects of the sustainability of shared micromobility services. So we used app-based travel diary survey data of micromobility users in 48 US cities. And overall, our study found that trip distance is the primary factor influencing car substitution. However, the interaction of car license and trip distance was important for understanding car substitution. And we also found the share of transit connection was smaller, which was about 5 to 13%. And based on our estimation, bike share services reduce roughly 0.25 miles per bike share trips and 0.15 miles per e-scooter share trips. And in this study, we also proposed two frameworks for building a planning tool for examining the BMT deduction from the future micromobility services. So we think the tool could be developed to help cities and for better planning for the micromobility services to achieve sustainable community. And for future research to make this tool, we will examine the relationship between pricing and demand as the price elasticity of demand is largely unknown in existing market. And we will also identify the expected distribution of trip distance in the market by examining the relationship with various factors. And because we had a few transit connection sample in our data set, so it will be encouraged to collect more evidence to identify whether transit connection factors matter in BMT reduction. And finally, we will also explore other potential indirect BMT reduction, which we didn't include in the equation, such as a change in destination choice. So these factors may be incorporated into the framework if we find the factor as significant. So yeah, that's it. Thank you for attending our presentation. And if you have any question regarding the presentation, yeah, contact me via email.
Thanks, Tatsuya. So while Tatsuya was speaking, I was trying to answer as many questions as I could. I left a few up that I thought maybe we could start with, and we'll see where we go. We have 10 more minutes. So Tatsuya, can you see the top question? Can you say anything about the relationship between trip purpose and mode substitution that we found?
Yeah, we included the trip purpose as a factor in our mode substitution model, but we didn't see any significant effect of the trip purpose on mode substitution. So
yeah, so I think we've seen it before in other data sets, but not in this data set. Is that correct?
Can you say again?
Did we see that in Sacramento as well in our prior work?
Yeah, we saw some significant effect of trip purpose on, I think, car substitution. Yeah, but I don't exactly remember how the result was. So yeah, if you are interested in, yeah, I can share the result.
It may be very city specific and context specific. Okay,
Yeah.
the next one I was going to attempt, it's not really a question, but it's something that I've been struggling with, and that is the comment also VMT is small. So we've been grappling with how small is the VMT reduction from micromobility services. And I think what we probably need, we as collectively as academics and practitioners, is to figure out what we're comparing it to. And is it just the VMT that occurs within the service boundaries of those services? And in which case we need estimates from other sources. That those could be model-based estimates. But comparing it to like regional travel estimates from regional travel demand models doesn't seem quite fair. But I agree, we need to know how small is this VMT reduction. And I think we focus a lot on VMT reduction, which of course relates to GHG reductions, but there's so many other co-benefits about micromobility services. So I just wanted to bring that point up, that this is just one metric. Let's see. Tatsuya, can you say what you think it means for bike shares less likely to replace ride hailing for commuting, whereas e-scooters have the opposite tendency? And then the question is, does this mean e-scooters are the more effective micromobility option? I think they mean more effective at car substituting.
Yeah, I don't know if that is effective or not, but I think our prior study in focusing on Sacramento, I think we also have the similar result about the bike share is less likely to replace ride hailing trips for commuting trip purpose. So one possible explanation would be the types of individual characteristics for bike shares use and e-scooter use may be different. So those who use bike share trip, they may originally they didn't use the bike ride hailing for commuting. So I think that's why we didn't see
Right. So
many.
it could be about the substitution, or it could be about the baseline behavior of the user. Yeah. So I guess we don't know the answer. We definitely wouldn't jump to the conclusion that e-scooters are a more effective mode. Well, the next question: when considering substitution of trips from an origin to destination, do you assume the vehicles use the same route? I'll just answer that we haven't done, we are still working on matching the routes to the network to do, route-based models. But for now, we just assume the distance. Tatsuya, do we do anything with the time, or we've discussed using travel time and then factors for different modes, but I think for now we just assume the same distance, which is not a valid assumption, right? We know that in most networks, well, there's two things that can happen. Micromobility trips can be more direct because searching for parking and all kinds of things for driving. But micromobility trips can also be more indirect if people are seeking out better bike infrastructure to get to their destination. So it can kind of go either way. Let's see. Wow, so many questions. Yeah, so Michael Hutnick asked, does the data show micromobility is allowing people to make trips they otherwise wouldn't make? Yes, we call those induced trips. Tetsuya, do you remember the percentage of those trips?
Induced trip?
Yeah, it was like 8% or 8 to 10%.
Yeah, I think about 10%.
Yeah, roughly 10% of the time when people took a vehicle, they Oh, 10 to 13%.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty consistent across other studies as well, that there's this sizable number of trips that people wouldn't have made if it wasn't for shared micromobility. And Michael's talking about the value of micromobility services beyond BMT. So yes, we agree. Daniel asks an interesting question about the high substitution rate or the VMT reduction rate in the Sacramento study versus this study. And I would say it's not just the Sacramento study. If you look at most studies or most surveys, so a lot of these are just city reports in the US, and they ask one simple survey question: on your last micromobility trip, what would you have done if the service wasn't available? Something to that effect. We'll see a much higher percentage of people reporting substituting for personal cars or ride hailing than in our study. And it's hard to explain. We could be just, this study could be biased in a sense that we ended up recruiting a lot more carless households than make up the population of micromobility users across the US. Although we attempted to waive the trips and we attempted to do everything we could, it could be the other way around. It could be that we're actually measuring people's travel behavior longer, and when they get down into the specific trip as they're making it, they're reporting it more accurately. But it's, again, still a counterfactual question. So it's not clear who's right. So unfortunately, I don't have a great answer. And then the e-bike versus non-e-bike, we have not looked into that yet in this data set. We can, we just, as I answered into another question, we have to be really careful how we report it, because part of our non-disclosure agreements with the companies is to not publish anything that identifies a specific company. So in many markets, that might identify a specific company. Tatsuya, do you see any questions you want to jump to? We maybe have time for one more. Are there any? The parking, we haven't looked at parking yet, have we?
No, we don't. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's another one about the bike share versus e-bike share. We haven't done that yet. Okay, let's end with this one. The question is about the cost of ridership and micromobility, because we didn't talk anything about cost, although I think Tatsuya may have made some point at the end of we need to think about pricing. And the comment says, I know in Sacramento bike share, when Jump first arrived, it was much more affordable. So our first study in the Sacramento region studied that. And so we saw like e-bikes in Davis with 6+ trips per day per bike, which is much, much, much greater demand than what we normally see in the private market for even e-scooters, which are, usually less than 2 trips per e-scooter per day. So I think that suggests that demand is suppressed by pricing. And if you look at the pricing mechanisms, it's outrageously expensive for e-scooters. For some of the bike shares with subscription services, that's not true. So we have a big difference in the pricing within our data set. And then something we didn't also report on is not only do we have differences in pricing by mode, but we have differences in pricing based on the users. So some are in equity programs that have reduced fares and some are not. So we're hoping to dig into that in the coming year. All right, I'm sorry we did not get to so many of these questions. If we are at time, Sarah, I don't know how you normally end the webinars if your internet connection's working. Do you want to put a plug in for NCST?
Let me see if it's working now. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, of course, it's working right at the end. Thank you everyone for joining. I'm sorry about my technical difficulties. And in case you didn't see the chat, I just wanted to share that we will post a transcription of the Q&A, including the responses that were typed. And then hopefully our presenters would be willing to answer a few of the unanswered ones as well. So we'll post all of those resources on the event page as soon as we can. And just a huge thank you to Dillon and Tatsuya for your presentation and your research. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking the time.